How long did they talk about now?
So,
And then they said, yeah. One might be a guess.
oh, okay. All right, we ready? Mic's on and all that?
Mics are on.
I hope you just turned it on. Maybe going to jail or something.
We only just started recording.
Okay, here we go. Thank God. All right, everyone, welcome to the BCAG Board of Directors meeting on September 24th, 2020. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Ready? Salute, pledge. I pledge
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and the republic which is stands, one nation,
under God, indivisible, with liberty
with justice for all.
And then I'd like to have a moment of silence for the fire victims and for all the people that have lost so much. Please join me in a moment of silence. Okay, next up, roll call, please.
Board Member Connolly?
Here.
Board Member Lucero? Here. Board Member Ritter?
Here.
Board Member Lambert?
Here.
Board Member Teeter? Board Alternate Bush?
Here.
Board Member Stone?
Here.
Board Alternate Johnson?
Here.
Board Member Reynolds? Board Member Jones? Here.
Really loud. All right, on to the consent agenda. Would any board member like to pull an item from the consent agenda? Anybody from the public like to pull something from the consent agenda? I'll entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
I
Move to approve. I'll second that. This is Tammy.
Okay, so I think Deborah beat you to it, Tammy. for
That's
second.
fine. That's why I said I'll second it.
It's all good. So we have a motion, second, and third. Anybody like to talk about it as well? All right, all those in favor, let's just say aye on this one. Aye.
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 Any opposed, nay? All right. All right, here we go. So next up, items for information. There's a update on the post-campfire study. Sarah.
Good morning, Board. This is an information item providing an update on the post-campfire regional population and transportation study. I'll provide a brief introduction to the study and hand it off to our consultant who's on the line, Mike Wallace with Fair and Peers, who will explain additional details on the pre- and post-campfire conditions memorandum. As a refresher on the study, the main objectives are to analyze regional population, housing, and employment, and traffic patterns for pre- and post-campfire time periods. The study will also update BCAG's transit and non-motorized plan and inform the 2024 RTP SCS and various land use, transportation, and housing plans and projects beyond the best available data used in the development of the 2020 RTP SCS. Following the campfire, the estimates of current population, housing, land use, and travel are unknown. In addition, the existing long-term forecasts of these planning elements are likely no longer applicable to the region. Last fall, Fair and Peers and their sub-consultants collected multiple sources of data to identify changes in travel patterns, economics, and demographics in Butte County before, meaning 2017-18, and after, meaning 2019-20, the campfire. The memorandum presented today explains the results of the data collection effort, which included feedback from multiple public outreach events and collaboration from BCAG's Planning Directors Group and Transportation Advisory Committee. I'll turn it over now to Mike Wallace with Fair and Peers to provide an overview of the memorandum.
Thanks, Sarah. I'll share my screen. Okay, so you should all be able to see the title slide of the presentation. Are you able to see that? Okay, thanks for confirming. Good morning. Thanks for having me attend this meeting. We've been working hard over the past many months collecting data and doing a lot of analysis. So we're really excited to finally share some results with you. Just a little bit of addition to what Sarah said on the goals of the project. You know, she mentioned that it's updating the regional travel to compare to the before condition. It'll be used for developing new population, housing, and employment forecasts and the associated travel with those forecasts, mostly to inform the 2024 RTP SES, and then also to update the short-term and the long-term transit and non-motorized plans. But also what I wanted to highlight is what this study is not doing. It's not identifying critical infrastructure for evacuation. It's not developing an evacuation plan, and it's also not developing a recovery plan. So just to be clear, it's mostly for regional planning, not for evacuation related planning. Just an overview of the project schedule. We've met with the project development team multiple times. That includes elected officials and others from cities, you know, planning commission or you know, city traffic engineers. We've done data collection that I'll present today in the form of counts, surveys. We've also used big data, you know, cellular data and that kind of thing, and then also a lot of public outreach. And then we've developed this report that I'm presenting. Ongoing, you know, in November and then also again in February, we'll go out to the public to get their feedback on the draft and then final draft plans. We'll finish up the population, housing, and employment forecasts, then the associated travel forecasts, and then ultimately the transit and active plans are still ongoing. So now I'll just dive into the data that we've collected. We collected traffic counts that included vehicle classification, that's passenger cars, medium duty trucks, and heavy trucks, and then also the speed of all vehicles on the roadways at the same locations we had as before the campfire. We also did a lot of public outreach and surveys, which was online. We had an onboard transit survey where people actually got on board and you know, either handed out pieces of paper or asked people questions, and then also that was online. Large employer surveys to make sure that we captured, you know, those major employment centers, especially for transit or, you know, commute type activity. And then just overall regional travel. You know, every person was invited to participate in the regional travel survey. We also did a couple of pop-up events in the winter that were highly attended and had a booth that was very engaging and interactive with the holiday spirit. So there's a lot of great outreach there. We collected cellular data, so it's anonymized travel data of where people go to and from, where their daytime and nighttime activities are. We collected that before and after the campfire. And then also residential and business locations where their registered addresses are. You know, their mailing addresses for the businesses, and then the home mailing address also. So just kind of a big picture overview of the traffic counts. Here's a map of green is where things increased and orange is where they decreased. The size of the circle is kind of the magnitude of the change, and then the intensity of color is a lot of change versus not a lot of change in the lighter color. So kind of as you can see, overall, travel patterns, traffic decreased by 3%, and passenger vehicles only decreased by 11%. In Chico, traffic volumes actually increased, and you know, Paradise obviously decreased. The other areas had moderate increases. So then when we look at trucks, you know, medium trucks had a pretty significant increase at all the locations we had counts, primarily due to the debris removal. And then there was a lot of changes in the debris removal routes, and then the largest changes, you know, obviously going to and from Paradise along the Skyway. Also, we looked at heavy trucks. There's an overall decrease, and there were a few locations that increased. You know, these noted in Chico that increased, Paradise, and then unincorporated county. There's a few increases, but overall decrease. We also looked at the travel speeds, and in general, what had happened is vehicles shifted from roadways that had higher speeds to roadways that had slower speeds because they were traveling more within cities rather than, you know, on Skyway between cities, that kind of thing. There was a few locations that increased, and we noted those increases here just so that we get a distribution of not just volume, but also what speed are they traveling. So this influence safety and emissions and, you know, those other types of things. We did a really extensive and thorough survey of the public versus all those different methods. The large employer survey was distributed through the employers. It was an online survey. The response rate was really good. We had a really nice distribution of the different large employers, and the main reason why they're not taking, they're driving alone, 96% of them, and the main reason is they need to make more stops along their way. 50% of them make a stop either to or from work, so taking a commute or bus is difficult, and then also finding a person that they could vanpool or carpool with was difficult. Those were the main reasons why they drove alone. The overall travel survey showed that the more people in the household and the more vehicles in the household, the less they would use transit. So that's what we found. And then, most people did drive alone. There's 85% of them. And either that's because they prefer to drive, 55%, they weren't sure if they had access to Beeline service or they didn't have it, 26%. And then it doesn't go to or from where they want to go. And then a few percentage also said that it was just too expensive relative to their perceived cost of driving. For the onboard transit survey, most people who take transit are transit dependent, meaning that they don't have a car or any other means to get to where they took this trip for the survey, and that they on average take 5 or more trips. 62% of people who responded take 5 or more trips per day, which that's a really good usage per person. Some of the feedback that they gave on where they suggest you invest in is more amenities at the shelters, providing benches and shade and these different types of things to make their trip more comfortable. When we did the public outreach, most respondents were talking about why they didn't want to walk or bike, and a lot of it was due to infrastructure, either being sidewalks or paths, and then also for bikes, they didn't have a place to park their bike on the end of their trip. Then a lot of them also talked about safety, whether that be the crossing the road at the intersection, the traffic volumes or speeds, and then also personal safety, from crime or those different types of things. So looking at the cell phone data, we saw that weekday trips entering Butte County compared to before the campfire increased by 14%, and weekend trips decreased by 9%, and that's mostly due to, well, we're speculating, but mostly probably due to people not needing to come into or out of the county on the weekends because they, migrated out of the county. And then the counties that they traveled to and from, Tehama, Yuba, and Sutter counties were the counties that had the biggest increase in weekday trips, and then similarly, the reverse trips in the evening. And then the total internal trips that happened within the county decreased by 9% on the weekdays and 25% on weekends. So overall travel, short distance travel within the county is decreasing, and then those longer distance going into or out of the county is generally increasing. So migration, this is where people move to or from. So when they moved out of the county, 30% went to Sacramento, followed by Placer and Sutter, with Yuba, El Dorado, and Yolo, making up the majority of the other trips where residents migrated out for at least a substantial amount of time that they were noticed to be not living in the county anymore. So if they lived in Paradise, they migrated within the county. Most of them went to Chico, followed by a few in Oroville, Magalia, and the other smaller cities or towns after, but a majority of them migrated to Chico. Looking at the housing status, one thing, not only the geographic distribution of how people live, but also the types of units that they live in. Fewer people lived in the houses that they owned compared to renting. So the shift in types of housing types also changed because of the campfire. This is just a summary of the housing types before and after, but it should be noted that the single family decreased by 85%, the mobile homes by 95%, and multifamily by 71% before and after the campfire. So that was a pretty substantial change in dwelling units due to the loss of structures. Then when we look at the business side, between 2018 and 2019, businesses that listed their addresses primarily operating within the county decreased by 18%. That's hard to tell if they moved or went out of business. It's unclear, except if they located within the county at a different location. And a lot of those were in the healthcare and social services industries. 25% of the reduction came from that sector. Retail trade decreased by 5% compared to before and after. And then the share of non-classified establishments increased by 23%. But on the positive side, there was also businesses that were started during this time period. Either they were new businesses or relocated with a substantial enough change that they were considered to be new. A lot of those happened in Chico, and then Oroville and unincorporated, followed by some others. So the nice thing is, even though there was businesses lost, there were also businesses created just geographically in a different location. Since this study also includes, how to recover and how to do a 2024 RTP and how to plan for transit, we also looked at other disasters that have occurred, and we compared an earthquake in Japan and the associated tsunami and the Hurricane Sandy, and tried to draw parallels or differences between the Camp Fire. The primarily significant difference was that Paradise was very focused, and that allowed people to either migrate within the county, like I showed, or out of the county. The other studies was a lot of devastation scattered across the area, not just so concentrated. So that was one positive takeaway from Paradise, is it was the people had somewhere to go after, because Chico and other places were not as impacted as Paradise. In terms of how quickly things can recover, the transportation infrastructure in Paradise was not significantly impacted, so that was great. But the water, sewer, and power lines were impacted, and that's kind of what might lead to a slower recovery. And through all the literature, what we found is that the coordination with the residents on how they want to recover, getting them to process all the paperwork and those kinds of things, working with the utility companies, but also the insurance companies, and making sure that residents have the finances and the insurance to be able to rebuild or relocate. Those are the really big impacting factors on how long it takes to recover. So the next steps in the study are we're going to use all this information and the recovery literature, coordinate with the PDT and BCAG staff to prepare a 2025, 2035, and 2045 population, housing, and employment forecast, and then the associated travel patterns. Based on that, we're going to look at the current transit plans and then where people might go to and from that are different, and update the transit and non-motorized plans. And then we'll take that out to the public to get their feedback on, are there things in their daily travel patterns that we're missing? So those are the basic overviews of the study and the next steps. So with that, I'll stop, and then I think, Sarah, we wanted to take a few questions.
We ought to call the roll. It's really hard. Let's just call the roll, and you get opportunity. And
Board Member Connolly?
no.
Board Member Lucero?
I just had a question about non-classified businesses. I just wondered what that meant exactly.
Yeah, so all of the data that we used are based on the NAICS codes of when businesses are classified for tax purposes in general, or reporting to the Economic Development Department. And those were like a lot of self-employed people who didn't know what category they were in, or the business was they didn't report that information because it's not required. If you don't have to pay payroll tax, you just are a business, but we don't know what occupation you're in.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Board Member Ritter?
Yeah, my only question was when you were mentioning about the 5 trips a day, can you say that was 5 trips a day where they were using mass transit, or they were 5 trips a day and they were in a private vehicle?
That's a good question. I think it was mass transit. But
Yeah, sorry. I was trying to unmute and the slides were advancing still. Yes, that was all related to onboard transit. So people who took 5 or more trips by Beeline specifically.
Okay, and
Is that
so,
because
sorry, go
Go
ahead,
ahead,
Bill.
Tam. Okay, is that because they're changing the bus and that counts as another trip, even though they're on one trip, it took 2 stops, or is it actually 5?
It depends on how the person answered the question. That's not the intent of the question, how we asked it. We asked how many trips, and that transfers shouldn't count. But of course, it depends on how the person interpreted that question. But the intent is going from like your home to work is one trip. And if you had to transfer, it's still the same trip. We don't consider a transfer to be a different trip.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That was my same question, Bill, if it included those, if you had to change buses or whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's counterintuitive. I mean, I would have to think, what would you think, Supervisor Ritter?
I think the way they asked the question is absolutely, I mean, I agree with the way that the question was asked and that the direction that was given to folks filling it out. But I think a trip has to be, if I'm going to the grocery store, if it takes 3 transfers to get there, it's still just one trip to the grocery store.
It doesn't make sense, is what we're trying to say.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Supervisor Ritter?
No, thank you.
Supervisor Lambert?
No.
Board Member Bush?
No questions.
Board Member Stone?
No questions, thank you.
Board Member Johnson?
No questions, thanks.
Board Member Jones? No questions.
Thank you.
Okay, number 8, Federal Transportation Improvement Program Development.
Good morning. BCAG, as the federally designated metropolitan planning organization, is required to prepare and update a federal transportation improvement program every 2 years. This next one, the 2021 FTIP, is required to be adopted and submitted to Caltrans by March 1st, 2021. The purpose of the FTIP is to identify all transportation projects that have federal transportation funds or require some type of approval by the Federal Transit Administration or Federal Highway Administration. The FTIP also includes transportation projects that are regionally significant so that we can include those in the air quality conformity analysis and determination. The FTIP will cover the next 4 federal fiscal years starting October 1st, 2020. Existing projects that are in the current 2019 FTIP that are not completed will carry forward. Typical funding in the FTIP include the State Transportation Improvement Program, such as the Highway 70 Corridor, Caltrans's State Highway Operations and Protection Program, Local Highway Bridge Program, Federal Transit Administration funds for regional transit, as well as Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program funds, Highway Improvement Program, and federally funded Active Transportation Program projects. As a result of COVID-19, the submittal and adoption deadlines have been postponed to March. Normally, we'd be adopting today, actually. All the deadlines have been pushed out. Since our submittal requirement is due March 1st, staff has identified a schedule to adopt this next FTIP at the February 25th board meeting. Congestion mitigation and air quality. As part of this FTIP, BCAG staff is initiating a call for new projects for accepting project applications for the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program. The purpose of the CMAQ program is to fund projects which reduce the region's non-attainment pollutants to address transportation air quality. In our county's case, it's to address ozone as a non-attainment pollutant. Staff does encourage all applicants to consider leveraging local or other grant funds with CMAQ. In addition, utilizing CMAQ funds for construction simplifies the project delivery process. It's a suggestion, not a requirement. Staff has identified the schedule for accepting new CMAQ project applications in the agenda item. Caltrans provides BCAG with the funding estimates to use in the FTIP document. Over the next 4 federal fiscal years, Caltrans has identified approximately $7.7 million. However, that figure does not include or account for what is already programmed, which is about $1.5 million in current projects throughout the region. That leaves a balance of approximately $6.2 million for funding consideration into this next FTIP. Updated project application and guidance will be presented to the BCAG Transportation Advisory Committee and posted on our website. In addition to CMAQ, staff has initiated a call for projects for the Highway Improvement Program, and this will follow the same process as the CMAQ call for projects. What's new is, as part of the Federal FAST Act legislation authorized by Congress, the HIP program was created to fund projects to address the needs on the federal aid system. Eligible work for the HIP program is pretty broad, so long as it's on the federal aid system. Typical components are environmental design, right-of-way, and construction, similar to the federal regional surface transportation program. It is not known if this program will carry forward into the next federal reauthorization. What's interesting about this HIP program, it was only for 3 of the 5 years of the FAST Act. In total, the apportionment to the region is $1.6 million, and this is, like the CMAQ, staff will be working this through the BCAG Transportation Advisory Committee with all of your respective public works directors. And what the draft projects will be presented to the BCAG board for funding consideration and folded into the adoption of the next FTIP. Be happy to answer questions.
Call the roll, please.
Board Member Jones? No questions. Board Member Johnson?
No questions.
Board Member Stone?
No questions, thank you.
Board Member Bush?
No questions.
Board Member Lambert?
No.
Board Member Ritter?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Board Member Lucero?
I just had one question. I was wondering, are these funds primarily like study funds?
No.
No, they're actual.
No study funds.
No study funds. Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Board Member Connolly?
Hey, number 9, Butte Regional Transit 4th Quarter Progress Report. Jim.
Good morning, Board. As you know, quarterly we give you updates to what's been happening with the public transit system, and we break it down into the 4 different elements: fixed route and paratransit, and then urban and rural. There have been 2 major events in Butte County over the past couple of years, and that has disrupted the operations and made financial data comparisons pretty challenging. Obviously, the Camp Fire 2 years ago disrupted a lot of our service and routes, and then the onset of COVID had a major impact. So, like I say, a lot of these comparisons, they're not going to make sense when you try to compare apples to oranges. When COVID first hit at the end of the 3rd quarter, the major impact on the system was during the fourth quarter, because that's when it took full effect. It depressed ridership, fares, service hours. For the most part, though, fixed route was able to operate most of its service hours. The biggest impact was probably on our student shuttle routes, 8 and 9, because when Chico State canceled in-person classes, we didn't have the demand and the need to run a full half-hour headway schedule there. So we reduced that to hourly headway. So basically cut out those two routes in half. Also, during a time when we had to have some of the drivers quarantine, we lost availability. So we had to cut some of our frequency during that time because we didn't have staff to run full service. But for the most part, fixed route service has been running pretty full. Unlike the fixed route service, paratransit hours were basically cut in half. That's because fixed route operates on a set schedule, regardless of the number of riders you have, where paratransit is basically rider dependent. You only schedule hours if somebody's made a reservation. And with ridership down so much, we didn't have to run the hours. In fact, overall, during the fourth quarter, ridership was down 72%. And that's obviously a huge hit. Additionally, during the quarter, we offered a free fare program for a 7-week period from the middle of April to the end of May. Beeline offered free fares to all passengers on both fixed route and paratransit. We were able to do that because of additional funding through the CARES Act signed by President Trump. And that helped us be able to offer free fares to our passengers. That provided a couple of benefits. One is it provided some financial relief to the riders during these tough times. And second, by not collecting fares, the people didn't have to enter through the front door and pay, at the fare box. And so they were able to enter the back door. And so it created social distancing between the passengers and our drivers. So it kept our drivers a little bit safer during this time. Looking at each of the individual routes or individual fixed route and paratransit. For the rural fixed route, it has a 10% fare box requirement, and it came in at 15.2% for the fiscal year. So it met that. Ridership, though, was down for the quarter 60% due to COVID and down 29% for the entire fiscal year. Expenditures for the services and supplies came in at about 92% of the budget. For the urban fixed route, it has a fare box requirement of 20%, and it came in at just under 17%. And a lot of that's due to restrictions from COVID, having less passengers, and also the free fare program. Ridership for the quarter was down approximately 73%. So that's a huge hit. A lot of that's because of Chico State not being in class. They typically account for about 28, 29% of our ridership. And so that was mostly gone, plus all businesses being, in lockdown. And then for the entire year, the system was down almost 21%. Passenger fares were 76% of the annual budget, which makes sense because that's 3/4 of it, and it was the last quarter where we really were hit. However, the expenditures were 100% of the budget because, as I said, you're still running the operation even if you're not collecting the fares. So we still had 100% expenditure. For the rural paratransit system, it has a requirement of 10%, and it came in at 9.7%. And this is true for both the urban and the rural paratransit system. We had a fare increase in September, and both systems were on track to make that 10%. That wasn't going to be an issue. However, once COVID hit, that number was affected. And so even though we're down, I'm not sure, I don't think the state's going to hold people liable for that because it's, no one's going to be making that fare box this year. Ridership in the rural system was down 62% for the quarter and over 47% for the entire year. The passenger revenues came in at 78%. Service hours were down over 45% for the quarter and 39% for the year. Expenditures were lower than expected at 82%, And that's because, as I said, less ridership, it's on demand. And so with less riders, you provide less service hours. The efficiency of the system, and this is true for both the rural and urban system, dropped a lot. It was 2.5 passengers per hour. Typically, we're well over 3 passengers per hour. But one of the major reasons for that is because we're trying to follow CDC guidelines and having less people on board. So typically where we may have had 2 or 3 passengers on a vehicle before, one vehicle, we would now maybe spread those 2 or 3 passengers out over a couple of vehicles so they could be distanced. So it definitely affected the efficiencies of the system. In the urban paratransit, same thing, we were down at 9.2%, not meeting the 10%. And ridership was down nearly 78% or 76% for the quarter and 15% for the year. Our service hours were down 58% for the quarter and almost 13% for the year. The passenger revenues came in at 81% of the budget. And as I said, again, the efficiency was down at 2.0%, basically 2 passengers per hour, which typically we've been having 3. Overall, there were no accidents in the quarter with 286,000 miles driven. That's great having no preventable accidents. One of the reasons the drivers were saying is because there was a lot less traffic on the road during this quarter, so a lot less chance to have an accident, which is great. And we only had 1 valid complaint for the quarter, despite serving over 263,000 passengers. All right, any questions?
All right. We did cover that they're not going to hold us accountable for the gap in the match, right? Sure.
I don't know, but I know, like, as far as like the NTD that we do reporting, at first, every time I have to do monthly reports, and every month all of a sudden, well, hold it, wait a minute, this is a red flag because it's way down over the previous year. Now they've finally updated that and they know it's going to be down, and so they reprogrammed their computer so it's not doing that. So I know at least they're taking that into consideration. I can't say officially if they're not going to, do anything about that gap, but
I would think the state's not going to hold most. I think probably every transit entity in the state of California didn't meet their fare box recovery ratio for one system or another. So that's under TDA statute. I have not seen anything in all of our information we receive regularly that's even an issue. I think simply everybody's gone through a big disaster this year. So.
Call the roll.
Board Member Lucero?
No questions, thank you.
Board Member Ritter?
No, thanks.
Board Member Lambert?
Nope.
Board Member Bush?
There we go. No questions.
Board Member Stone?
No questions, thank you.
Board Member Johnson?
No questions.
Board Member Jones? No questions.
thank you.
Hopefully pick that up. All right, next I'd like to thank the board for their patience, when we zoom in on this. It's somewhat awkward. And I thank the clerk for reversing the role without asking, so I really appreciate that, staff. Right now, we're going to take members of the public may present items to the BCAG Board of Directors. No action may be taken other than placement on a future agenda. Seeing no public, so we're clear there. All right, we're going to adjourn. Next meeting will be here Thursday, October 22nd, right here. Same time, 9 a.m.
Thanks.
Adjourn. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.